The second notebook. On the shore, at a point so close to the ocean, one might imagine it was there that the waves broke, stood a row of over 20 fairly tall cherry trees with coal black trunks. Every April, when the new school year was about to begin, these trees would display their dazzling blossoms and their moist brown leaves against the blue of the sea. Soon a snowstorm of blossoms would scatter innumerable petals into the water, flecking the surface with points of white, which the waves carried back to the shore. This beach, strewn with cherry blossoms, served as the playground of the high school I attended. Stylized cherry blossoms flowered even on the badge of regulation school cap and on the buttons of our uniforms. A distant relative of mine had a house nearby, which was one reason why my father had especially selected for me the school of cherry blossoms by the sea. I was left in the care of the family, whose house was so close to the school that even after the morning bell had rung, I could still make it to my class in time if I ran. That was the kind of lazy student I was. But I nevertheless managed, thanks to my accustomed antics, to win popularity with my schoolmates. This was my first experience living in a strange town. I found it far more agreeable than my native place. One might attribute this, perhaps, to the fact that my clowning had by this time become so much a part of me that it was no longer such a strain to trick others. I wonder, though, if it was not due instead to the incontestable difference in the problem involved in performing before one's own family and strangers, or in one's own town and elsewhere. This problem exists no matter how great a genius one may be. An actor dreads most the audience in his hometown. I imagine the greatest actor in the world would be quite paralyzed in a room where all his family and relatives were gathered to watch him. But I had learned to play my part. I had moreover been quite a success. It was inconceivable that so talented an actor would fail away from home. The fear of human beings continued to rife in my breast. I am not sure whether more or less intensely than before, but my acting talents had unquestionably matured. I could always convulse the classroom with laughter, and even as the teacher protested what a good class it would be if only I were not in it, he would be laughing behind his hand. At a word from me, even the military drill instructor, whose more usual idiom was a barbarous, thunderous roar, would burst into helpless laughter. Just when I had begun to relax my guard a bit, fairly confident that I had succeeded by now in concealing completely my true identity, I was stabbed in my back quite unexpectedly. The assailant, like most people who stab in the back, bordered on being a simpleton. The puniest boy in the class, whose scrofulous face and floppy jacket, with sleeves too long for him, was complemented by a total lack of proficiency in his studies, and by such clumsiness in military drill and physical training that he was perpetually designated as an onlooker. Not surprisingly, I failed to recognize the need to be on my guard against him. That day, Takeichi, that was the boy's name as I recall, was an unusual onlooking during the physical training period, while the rest of us drilled on the horizontal bar. Deliberately assuming as solemn as face as I could muster, I lunged overheard at the bar, shouting with the effort. I missed the bar and sailed on as if I were making a broad jump, landing with a thud on the sand on the seat of my pants. This failure was entirely premeditated, but everybody burst out laughing, exactly as I had planned. I got to my feet with a rueful smile and was brushing the sand from my pants when Takeichi, who had crept up from somewhere behind, poked me in the back. He murmured, "You did it on purpose." I trembled all over. I might have guessed that someone would detect that I had deliberately missed the bar, but that Takeichi should have been the one came as a bolt from the blue. I felt as if I had seen the world before we burst in an instant into the raging flames of hell. It was all I could do to suppress a wild shriek of terror. The ensuing days were imprinted with my anxiety and dread. I continued on the surface, making everybody laugh with my miserable clowning, but now and then painful sighs escaped my lips. Whether I did Takeichi would see through it, and I was sure he would soon start spreading the word to everyone he saw. At this thought, my forehead broke out in sweat. I stared around me vacantly, with the wild eyes of a madman. If it were possible, I felt I would like to keep a 24 hours a day surveillance over Takechi, never stirring from him, morning, noon, or night, to make sure that he did not divulge the secret. I brooded over that I should do. I, I would devote the hours spent with him to persuading him that my antics were not on purpose, but the genuine article. If things went well, I would like to become his inseparable friend, but if this proved utterly impossible, I had no choice but to pray for his death. Typically enough, the one thing that never occurred to me was to kill him. During the course of my life, I have wished innumerable times that I might meet with a violent death, but I have never once desired to kill anybody. I thought that in killing a dread adversary, I might actually be bringing him happiness. In order to win over Takeichi, I clothed my face in the gentle, beguiling smile of the false Christian. I strolled everywhere with him, my arm lightly around his scrawny shoulders, my head tilted affectionately towards him. I frequently would invite him in honeyed, cajoling tones to come and play in the house where I was lodging. But instead of an answer, he always gave me only blank stares in return. One day, after school was let out, it must have been in the early summer, there was a sudden downpour. The other students were making a great fuss about getting back to their lodgings, but since I lived just around the corner, I decided to make a dash for it. Just as I was about to rush outside, I noticed Takechi hovering dejectedly in the entrance way. I said, "Let's go, I'll lend you my umbrella." I grabbed Takemichi's hand as he hesitated and ran out with him into the rain. When we arrived home, I asked my aunt to dry our jackets. I had succeeded in luring Takeichi to my room. The household consisted of my aunt, a woman in her fifties, and my two cousins, the older of whom was a tall, frail, bespectacled girl of about 30. She had been married at one time but was later separated. And the younger, a short, round faced girl who looked fresh out of high school. The ground floor of the house was given over to a shop where small quantities of stationery supplies and sporting goods were offered for sale, but the principal source of income was the rent from the 5 or 6 tenants built in by late uncle. Takeichi, standing haplessly in my room, said my ears hurt. They must have got wet in the rain. I examined his ears and discovered they were both running horribly. The lobes seemed filled with the bursting with pus. I simulated an exaggerated concern. "This looks terrible. It must hurt." Then, in the gentle tones a woman might use, I apologized. "I'm so sorry I dragged you out in all this rain." I went downstairs to fetch some cotton wool and alcohol. Takechi lay on the floor with his head on my lap, and I painstakingly swabbed his ears. Even Takechi seemed not to be aware of the hypocrisy, the scheming behind my actions. Far from it. His comment, as he lay there with his head pillowed in my lap, was, "I'll bet lots of women will fall for you." It was his illiterate approximation of a compliment. This, I was to learn in later years, was a kind of demoniacal prophecy, more horrible than Takeichi could have realized. To fall for, to be fallen for. I feel in these words something unspeakably vulgar, farcical, and at the same time extraordinarily complacent. Once these expressions put in an appearance, no matter how solemn the place, the silent cathedrals of melancholy crumble, leaving nothing but an impression of fatuousness. It is curious, but the cathedrals of melancholy are not necessarily demolished if one can replace the vulgar. What a messy business it is to be fallen for, by the more literary, what uneasiness lies in being loved. Takeichi uttered that idiotic compliment that women would fall for me because I had been kind enough to clean the discharge from his ears. My reaction at the time was merely to blush and smile, without saying a word in return, but, to tell the truth, I already had a faint inkling of what his prophecy implied. No, to speak in those terms of the atmosphere engendered by so vulgar an expression as to fall for, is to betray a precocity in sentiment not even worthy of the dialogue of the romantic lead in a musical comedy. I certainly was not moved by the farcical, self-satisfied emotions suggested by the phrase "to have a faint inkling." I've always found the female of the human species many times more difficult to understand than the male. In my immediate family, women outnumbered the men, and many of my cousins were girls. There was also the maidservant of the crime. I think it would be no exaggeration to say that my only playmates while I was growing up were girls. Nevertheless, it was with very much the sensation of treading on thin ice that I associated with these girls. I could almost never guess their motives. I was in the dark. At times I made indiscreet mistakes which brought me painful wounds. These wounds, unlike the scars from the lashing a man might give, cut inwards very deep, like an internal hemorrhage, bringing intense discomfort. Once inflicted, it was extremely hard to recover from such wounds. Women led me only to throw me aside. They mocked and tortured me when others were around, only to embrace me with passion as soon as everybody had left. Women sleep so soundly, they seem so to be dead. Who knows? Women may live in order to sleep. These and various other generalizations were products of an observation of women since boyhood days, but my conclusion was that though women appear to belong to the same species as men, they are actually quite different creatures, and these incomprehensible, insidious beings have, fantastic as it seems, always looked after me. In my case, such an expression as to be fallen for, or even to be loved, is not in the least appropriate. Perhaps it describes the situation more accurately to say that I was looked after. Women were also less demanding than men when it came to my clowning. When I played the jester, men did not go on laughing indefinitely. I knew that if I got carried away by my success in entertaining a man and overdid the role, my comedy would fall flat, and I was always careful to quit at a suitable place. Women, on the other hand, have no sense of moderation. No matter how long I went on with my antics, they would ask for more, and I would become exhausted, responding to their insatiable demands for encores. They really laugh an amazing amount of the time. I suppose one can say that women stuff themselves with far more pleasures than men. The two cousins in whose house I was living while attending school used to visit my room whenever they had time. The knock on the door, no matter how often it came, never failed to startle me, so that I almost jumped in fright. Are you studying? No, I would say with a smile, shutting my book. I would launch into some silly story miles removed from what I was thinking. Today at school, the geography teacher, the one we call the walrus. One evening, my cousin came to my room, and after they had compelled me to clown an unmerciful lengths, one of them proposed, Yozo, let's see how you look with glasses on. Why? Don't make such a fuss. Put them on. Here, take these glasses. They invariably spoke in the same harsh, per- peremptory tones. The clown meekly put on the older girl's glasses. My cousins were convulsed with laughter. You look exactly like him, exactly like Harold Lloyd. The American movie comedian was very popular at the time in Japan. I stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, raising one arm in greeting. I should like on this occasion to thank all my Japanese fans. I went through the motions of making a speech. They laughed all the harder. From then on, whenever a Harold Lloyd movie came to town, I went to see it and secretly studied his expressions. One autumn evening, as I was lying in bed reading a book, the older of my cousins, I always called her sister, suddenly darted into my room quick as a bird and collapsed over my bed. She whispered through her tears, Yozo, you'll help me, I know. I know you will. Let's run away from this terrible house together. Oh, help me, please. She continued in this hysterical vein for a while, only to burst into tears again. This was not the first time that a woman had put on such a scene before me, and sister's excessively emotional words did not surprise me much. I felt instead a certain boredom at their banality and emptiness. I slipped out of bed, went to my desk, and picked up a persimmon. I peeled it and offered sister a section. She ate it, still sobbing, and said, Have you any interesting books? Lend me something. I chose Sosaki's I Am a Cat from my bookshelf and handed it to her. Thanks for the persimmon, sister said as she left the room and an embarrassed smile on her face. Sister was not the only one. I have often felt that I would find it more complicated, troublesome, and unpleasant to ascertain the feeling by which a woman lives than to plumb the innermost thoughts of an earthworm. Long personal experience had taught me that when a woman suddenly bursts into hysterics, the way to restore her spirits is to give her something sweet. Her younger sister, Sechan, would even bring friends to my room, and in my usual fashion I amused them all with perfect impartiality. As soon as a friend had left, Sechan would tell me disagreeable things about her, inevitably concluding, She's a bad girl. You must be careful of her. If that's the case, I wanted to say, you needn't have gone to the trouble of bringing her here. Thanks to Sechan, almost all the visitors to my room were girls. This, however, by no means implies that Takeichi's compliment, women will fall for you, had yet been realized. I was merely the Harold Lloyd of Northeast Japan. Not for some years would Takeichi's silly statement come palpitatingly alive, metamorphosed into a sinister prophecy. Takeichi made one other important gift to me. One day he came to my room to play. He was waving a brightly colored picture, which he proudly displayed. It's a picture of a ghost, he explained. I was startled that instant, as I could not help feeling, in later years, determined my path of escape. I knew that what Takeichi was showing me. I knew that it was only the familiar self-portrait of Van Gogh. When we were children, the French Impressionist school was very popular in Japan, and our first introduction to an appreciation of Western painting most often began with such works. The paintings of Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Renoir were familiar even to students at country schools, mainly through photographic reproductions. I myself have seen quite a few colored photographs of Van Gogh's paintings. His brushwork and the vividness of his colors had intrigued me, but I had never imagined his pictures to be of ghosts. I took from a bookshelf a volume of Modigliani's reproductions, and showed Takeichi the familiar nudes with skin the color of burnished copper. How about these? Do you suppose they're ghosts too? They're terrific. Takeichi widened his eyes in admiration. This one looks like a horse out of hell. They really are ghosts then, aren't they? I wish I could paint pictures of ghosts like that, said Takeichi. There are some people whose dread of human beings is so morbid that they reach a point where they yearn to see with their own eyes monsters of ever more horrible shapes. And the more nervous they are, the quicker to take fright, the more violent the prey that every storm will be. Painters who have had this mentality after repeated wounds and intimidations at the hands of the apparitions called human beings have often come to believe in phantasms. They plainly saw monsters in broad daylight in the midst of nature. And they did not fob people off with clowning. They did their best to depict these monsters just as they had appeared. Takeichi was right. They had dared to paint pictures of devils. These, I thought, would be my friends in the future. I was so excited, I could have wept. I'm going to paint too. I'm going to paint pictures of ghosts and devils and horses out of hell. My voice as I spoke these words to Takeichi was lowered to a barely audible whisper, Why? I don't know. Ever since elementary school days, I enjoyed drawing and looking at pictures, but my pictures failed to win the reputation amongst my fellow students that my comic stories did. I've never had the least trust in the opinions of human beings, and my stories represented to me nothing more than the clown's gesture of greeting to his audience. They enraptured all of my teachers, but for me they were devoid of the slightest interest. Only my paintings to the depiction of the object, my cartoons were something else again, did I devote any real efforts to my original thought, though childish style. The copybooks for drawing we used at school were dreary. The teachers' pictures were incredibly inept, and I was obliged to experiment for myself entirely without direction, using every method of expression which came to me. I owned a set of oil paints and brushes from the time I entered high school. I sought to model my techniques on those of the Impressionist school, but my pictures remained flat as a paper cutouts, and seemed to offer no promise of ever developing into anything. But Takeichi's words made me aware that my mental attitudes towards painting had been completely mistaken. What superficiality and what stupidity there is in trying to depict in a pretty manner things which one has thought pretty. The masters, through their subjective perceptions, created beauty out of trivialities. They did not hide their interest even in things which were nauseatingly ugly, but soaked themselves in the pleasure of depicting them. In other words, they seemed not to rely in the least on the misconceptions of others. Now that I had been initiated by Takeichi into these rude secrets of the art of painting, I began to do a few self portraits, taking care that they not be seen by my female visitors. The pictures I drew were so heartrending as to stupefy even myself. Here was the true self I had so desperately hidden. I had smiled cheerfully. I had made others laugh. But this was the harrowing reality. I secretly affirmed this self, was sure that there were no escape from it. But naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone but Takeichi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance, when once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might not recognize my true self when they saw it, but imagine that it was just some new twist to my clowning. Occasion for additional snickers. This would have been most painful of all. I therefore hid the pictures in the back of my cupboard. In school drawing classes, I also kept secret my ghost style techniques and continued to paint as before in the conventional idiom of pretty things. To Takeichi, and to him alone, I could display my easily wounded sensibilities, and I did not hesitate now to show him my self portraits. He was very enthusiastic, and I painted two or three more, plus a picture of a ghost, earning from Takeichi the prediction, "You'll be a great painter someday." Not long afterwards, I went up to Tokyo. On my forehead were imprinted the two prophecies uttered by half-wit Takeichi, that I would be fallen for and that I would become a great painter. I wanted to enter an art school, but my father put me into college, intending eventually to make a civil servant out of me. This was the sentence passed on me, and I, who have never been able to answer back, dumbly obeyed. At my father's suggestion, I took the college entrance examinations a year early, and I passed. By this time, I was really quite weary of my high school by the sea and the cherry blossoms. Once in Tokyo, I immediately began life in a dormitory, but the squalor and violence appalled me. This time, I was in no mood for clowning. I got the doctor to certify that my lungs were affected. I left the dormitory and went to live in my father's town house in Ueno. Communal living had proved quite impossible for me. It gave me chills just to hear such words as the ardor of youth or youthful pride. I could not by any stretch of the imagination soak myself in college spirit. The classrooms and the dormitories seemed like the dumping grounds of distorted sexual desires, and even my virtually perfected antics were of no use there. When the diet was not in session, my father spent only a week or two of the month at the house. While he was away, there would be just three of us in a rather imposing mansion, an elderly couple who looked after the premises, and myself. I frequently cut classes, but not because I felt like sightseeing in Tokyo. It looks as if I shall end my days without ever having seen the Meiji Shrine, the statue of Kusunoki Masashige, or the tombs of the 47 Ronin. Instead, I would spend whole days in the house reading and painting. When my father was in town, I sat out of school promptly every morning, although sometimes I actually went to an art class given by a painter in Hongo and practiced sketching for 3 or 4 hours at a time with him. Having been able to escape from the college dormitory, I felt rather cynically. This may have been my own bias, that I was now in a rather special position. Even if I attended lectures, it was more like an auditor than a regular student. Attending classes became all the more tedious. I had gone through elementary and high school, and was now in college without ever having been able to understand what was meant by school spirit. I never even tried to learn the school songs. Before long, a student at the art class was to initiate me into the mysteries of drink, cigarettes, prostitutes, pawn shops, and left wing thought. A strange combination, but it actually happens that way. This student's name was Masao Horiki. He had been born in downtown Tokyo, was 6 years older than myself, and was a graduate of a private art school. Having no atelier at home, he used to attend the art class I frequented, where he was supposedly continuing his study of oil painting. One day, when we still barely knew each other by sight, we hadn't as yet exchanged a word, he suddenly said to me, "Can you lend me 5 yen?" I was so taken aback that I ended up giving him the money. "That's fine," he said. "Now for some liquor. You're my guest." I couldn't very well refuse, and I was dragged off to a cafe near the school. This marked the beginning of our friendship. "I've been noticing you for quite a while there." That bashful smile, that's the special mark of the promising artist. Now, as a pledge of our friendship, bottoms up. He called one of the waitresses to our table. "Isn't he a handsome boy? You mustn't fall for him now. I'm sorry to say it, but ever since he appeared in our art class, I've only been the second handsomest." Horiki was a swarthy, but his features were regular and most unusual for an art student. He always wore a neat suit and a conservative necktie. His hair was pomaded and parted in the middle. The surroundings were unfamiliar to me. I kept folding and unfolding my arms nervously, and my smiles were now really bashful. In the course of drinking 2 or 3 glasses of beer, however, I began to feel a strange lightness of liberation. I started, "I've been thinking, I'd like to enter a real art school." "Don't be silly. That's useless. Schools are useless. The teachers who immerse themselves in nature, the teachers who show profound sympathy for nature." I felt not the least respect for his opinions. I was thinking, he's a fool and his paintings are rubbish, but he might be a good person for me to go out with. For the first time in my life, I had met a genuine city good for nothing. No less than myself, though in a different way. He was entirely removed from the activities of the human beings of the world. We were of one species, if only in that we were both disoriented. At the same time, there was a basic difference in us. He operated without being conscious of his partiality, or, for that matter, without giving any recognition to the misery of that partiality. I despised him as one fit only for amusement, a man with whom I associated for the sole purpose. At times, I even felt ashamed of our friendship, but in the end, as a result of going out with him, even Horiki proved too strong for me. At first, however, I was convinced that Horiki was a nice fellow, an unusually nice fellow, and despite my habitual dread of human beings, I relaxed my guard to the extent of thinking that I had found a fine guide to Tokyo. To tell the truth, when I first came to the city, I was afraid to board a streetcar because of the conductor. I was afraid to enter the kabuki theater for fear of the usherettes standing along the sides of the red carpeted staircase at the main entrance. I was afraid to go into the restaurant because I was intimidated by the waiters furtively hovering behind me waiting for my plates to be emptied. Most of all, I dreaded paying a bill. My awkwardness when I handed over the money after buying something did not arise from any stinginess, but from excessive tension, excessive embarrassment, excessive uneasiness and apprehension. My eyes would swim in my head and the whole world grow dark before me, so that I felt half out of my mind. There was no question of bargaining. Not only did I often forget to pick up my change, but I quite frequently forgot to take home the things I had purchased. It was quite impossible for me to make my way around Tokyo by myself, and I had no choice but to spend whole days at a time lolling about the house. So I turned my money over to Horiki, and the two of us went out together. He was a great bargainer, and this perhaps earned him the ranking of expert in pleasure seeking. He displayed unusual proficiency in spending minimal sums of money with maximum effort. His talents extended to getting wherever he wanted in the shortest possible time without ever having recourse to taxis. He used by turns, as seemed appropriate, the streetcar, the bus, and even steam launches in the river. He gave me a practical education. Thus, if we stopped in the morning at a certain restaurant or away home from a prostitute's and had a bath with our meal, it was a cheap way of experiencing the sensation of living luxuriously. He also explained that beef with rice or skewered chicken, the sort of dishes you can get at a roadside stand, are cheap but nourishing. He guaranteed that nothing got you drunker quicker than brandy. At any rate, as far as the bill was concerned, he never caused me to feel the least anxiety or fear. Another thing which saved me when with Horiki was that he was completely uninterested in what his listener might be thinking, and could pour forth a continuous stream of nonsensical chatter 24 hours a day, in whichever direction the eruption of his passions led him. It may have been that his passions consisted in ignoring the feelings of his listener. His loquacity ensured that there would be absolutely no danger of our falling into uncomfortable silences when our pleasures had fatigued us. In dealings with other people, I had always been on my guard lest those frightful silences occur. But since I was naturally slow of speech, I could only stave them off by a desperate recourse of clowning. Now, however, that stupid Horiki, quite without realizing it, was playing the part of the clown, and I was under no obligation to make appropriate answers. It sufficed if I merely let the stream of his words flow through my ears, and once in a while commented with a smile, "Not really." I soon came to understand that drink, tobacco, and prostitutes were all excellent means of dissipating, even for a few moments, my dread of human beings. I came even to feel that if I had to sell every last possession to obtain these means of escape, it would be well worth it. I never could think of prostitutes as human beings or even as women. They seemed more like imbeciles or lunatics, but in their arms I felt absolute security. I could sleep soundly. It was pathetic how utterly devoid of greed they really were. And perhaps because they felt for me something like an affinity for their kind, these prostitutes always showed me a natural friendliness which never became oppressive. Friendliness with no ulterior motive. Friendliness stripped of high pressure salesmanship for someone who might never come again. Some nights I saw these imbecile, lunatic prostitutes with the halo of Mary. I went to them first to escape from my dread of human beings, to seek a mere night of repose. But in the process of diverting myself with these kindred prostitutes, I seemed to have acquired before I was aware of it a certain offensive atmosphere which clung inseparably to me. This was a quite unexpected byproduct of my experience, but gradually it became more manifest, until Horiki pointed it out, to my amazement and consternation. I had, quite objectively speaking, passed through an apprenticeship in women at the hands of prostitutes, and I had of late become quite adept. The severest apprenticeship in women, they say, is with prostitutes, and that makes it the most effective. The odor of the lady killer had come to permeate me, and women, not only prostitutes, instinctively detected it and flocked to me. This obscene and inglorious atmosphere was the bonus I received, and it was apparently far more noticeable than the recuperative effects of my apprenticeship. Horiki informed me of it half as a compliment, I suppose, but it struck a painful chord in me. I remembered how now clumsily written letters from bar girls, and the general's daughter, a girl of 20, whose house was next to mine, and who, every morning when I went to school, was always hovering around her gate, all dressed up for no apparent reason, and the waitress at the steak restaurant who, even when I didn't say a word, and the girl at the tobacco shop I patronized, who always would put in the package of cigarettes she handed me, and the woman in the seat next to mine at the Kabuki theater. At the time when I was drunk and fell asleep on the streetcar in the middle of the night, and that letter burning with passion that came unexpectedly from a girl relative in the country, and the girl whoever it was, who left a doll one she had made herself for me when I was away. With all of them, I had been extremely negative, and the stories had gone no further, remaining undeveloped fragments. But it was an undeniable fact, and not just some foolish delusions on my part, that there lingered about me an atmosphere which could send women into sentimental reveries. It caused me a bitterness akin to shame to have this pointed out by someone like Horiki. At the same time, I suddenly lost all interest in prostitutes. To show off his modernity, I can't think of any other reason, Horiki also took me one day to a secret communist meeting. I don't remember exactly what it was called. A reading society, I think. A secret communist meeting may have been for Horiki just one more of the sights of Tokyo. I was introduced to the comrades and obliged to buy a pamphlet. I then heard a lecture on Marxian economics delivered by an extraordinarily ugly young man, the great of the honor. Everything he said seemed exceedingly obvious and undoubtedly true, but I felt sure that something more obscure, more frightening lurked in the hearts of human beings. Greed did not cover it, nor did vanity, nor was it simply a combination of lust and greed. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt that there was something inexplicable at the bottom of human society which was not reducible to economics. Terrified as I was by this weird element, I assented to materialism as naturally as water finding its own level. But materialism could not free me from my dread of human beings. I could not feel the joy of hope a man experiences when he opens his eyes on young leaves. Nevertheless, I regularly attended two meetings of this reading society. I found it uproariously amusing to see my comrades, their faces tense as though they were discussing matters of life and death, absorbed in the study of theories so elementary they were on the order of one and one makes two. I tried to take some of the strain out of the meetings with my usual antics. That was why I imagined the oppressive atmosphere of the group gradually relaxed. I came to be so popular that I was considered indispensable at the meetings. These simple people perhaps fancied that I was just as simple as they, an optimistic, laughter loving comrade, but if such was their view, I was deceiving them completely. I was not their comrade, yet I attended every single meeting and performed for them my full repertory of farce. I did it because I liked to, because those people pleased me, and not necessarily because we were linked by any common affection derived from Marx. Irrationality, I found the thought faintly pleasurable, or rather, I felt at ease with it. What frightened me was the logic of the world, and it laid a foretaste of something incalculably powerful. Its mechanism was incomprehensible, and I could not possibly remain closeted in that windowless, bone chilling room, though outside lay the sea of irrationality. It was far more agreeable to swim in its waters until presently I drowned. People talk of social outcasts. The words apparently denote the miserable losers of the world, the vicious ones, but I feel as though I have been a social outcast from the moment I was born. If ever I meet someone society has designated as an outcast, I invariably feel affection for him, an emotion which carries me away in melting tenderness. People also talk of a criminal consciousness. All my life, in this world of human beings, I have been tortured by such a consciousness, but it has been my faithful companion, like a wife in poverty, and together, just the two of us, we have indulged in our forlorn pleasures. This, perhaps, has been one of the attitudes in which I have gone on living. People also commonly speak of the wound of a guilty conscience. In my case, the wound appeared of itself when I was an infant, and with the passage of time, far from healing it, has grown only the deeper, until now it has reached the bone. The agonies I have suffered night after night have made for a hell composed of an infinite diversity of tortures, but, though this is a very strange way to put it, the wound has gradually become dearer to me than my own flesh and blood, and I have thought its pain to be the emotion of the wound as it lived, or even its murmur of affection. For such a person as myself, the atmosphere of an underground movement was curiously soothing and agreeable. What appealed to me, in other words, was not so much its basic aims as its personality. The movement served Horiki merely as a pretext for idiotic banter. The only meeting he attended was the one where he introduced me. He gave, as his reason for not coming again, the stupid joke that Marxists should study not only the productive aspects of society, but the consumptive ones too. At any rate, the consumptive aspects were the only ones we observed together. When I think back on it now, in those days, there were Marxists of every variety. Some, like Horiki, called themselves such out of an empty modernity. An attraction for its odor of irrationality led others, like myself, to participate in the movement. I am sure that if the true believers in Marxism had discovered what Horiki and I were really interested in, they would have been furious with us and driven us out immediately as vile traitors. Strange to say, however, neither Horiki nor I ever came close to being expelled. On the contrary, I felt so much more relaxed in this irrational world than in the world of rational gentlemen that I was able to do what was expected of me in a sound manner. I was therefore considered a promising comrade and entrusted with various jobs fraught with a ludicrous degree of secrecy. As a matter of fact, I never once refused any of their jobs. Curiously docile, I performed whatever they asked of me with such unruffled assurance that the dogs, that was the name by which the comrades referred to the police, suspected nothing, and I was never so much as picked up for questioning. Smiling, making others smile, I punctuously acquitted myself of all their dangerous missions. The people in the movement observed such excessive precautions they were perpetually prey to life and death tensions as suggest some clumsy imitation of the detective novel. The missions on which I was employed were really of stupefying inconsequentiality, but the comrades kept themselves worked up into a state of frantic excitement by incessantly reminding themselves how dangerous these errands were. I felt at the time that if I should become a party member and got caught, not even the prospect of spending the rest of my life in prison would bother me. It occurred to me that prison life might actually be pleasanter than groaning away my sleepless nights in a hellish dread of the realities of life, as led by human beings. Even when my father and I were living in the same house, he was kept so busy receiving guests or going out that sometimes 3 or 4 days elapsed without our seeing each other. This, however, did not make his presence any the less oppressive and intimidating. I was just thinking, without us yet daring to propose it, how I would like to leave the house and find lodging elsewhere, when I learned from our old caretaker that my father apparently intended to sell the house. Father's term of office as a member of the Diet would soon expire, and, doubtless for many reasons, he seems to have no intention of standing for election again. Perhaps I do not pretend to understand my father's thoughts any better than those of a stranger. He had decided to build a retreat somewhere at home. He never had felt much affection for Tokyo, and he must have concluded that it was pointless to maintain a house with servants just for the convenience of a mere college student like myself. At any rate, the house was sold before long, and I moved to a gloomy room in an old lodging house in Hongo, where I was immediately beset by financial worries. My father had been giving me a fixed allowance for spending money each month. I would disappear in 2 or 3 days' time, but there had always been cigarettes, liquor, and fruit in the house, and other things. Books, stationery, and anything in the way of clothing could be charged at the shops in the neighborhood, as long as it was one of the shops my father patronized. It made no difference, even if I left the place without offering so much as a word of explanation. Then suddenly I was thrown on my own indulgence and had to make ends meet on the allowance doled out each month from home. I was quite at my wits' end. The allowance disappeared in the customary 2 or 3 days, and I would be almost wild with fright and despair. I sent off barrages of telegrams begging for money of my father, my brothers, and my sister by turns. In the wake of the telegrams went letters giving details. The facts, as stated in the letters, were absurd fabrications without exceptions. I thought it a good strategy to make people laugh when asking favors of them. Under Horik's tutelage, I also began to frequent the pawn shops. Despite everything, I was chronically short of money, and I was incapable of living all by myself in those lodgings where I didn't know a soul. It terrified me to sit by myself quietly in my room. I felt frightened, as if I might be set upon or struck by someone at any moment. I would rush outside either to help in the activities of the movement or to take the round in the bars with Horiki, drinking cheap sake wherever we went. I almost completely neglected both my schoolwork and my painting. Then, in November of my second year in college, I got involved in a love suicide with a married woman older than myself. This changed everything. I had stopped attending classes and no longer devoted a minute of study to my courses. Amazingly enough, I seemed nevertheless to be able to give sensible answers in the examinations, and I managed somehow to keep my family under the delusion that all was well. But my poor attendance finally caused the school to send my father a confidential report. My elder brother, acting on behalf of my father, thereupon addressed me a long, sternly phrased letter, warning me to change my ways. More pressing causes of grief to me were my lack of money and the jobs required of me by the movement, which had become so frequent and frenetic that I could no longer perform them half in the spirit of fun. I had been chosen leader of all the Marxist student action groups in the schools of central Tokyo. I raced about here and there, maintaining liaison. In my raincoat pocket, I carried a little knife I had bought for use in the event of an armed uprising. I remember now that it had a delicate blade hardly strong enough to sharpen a pencil. My fondest wish was to drink myself into a sound stupor, but I hadn't the money. Requests for my services came from the party so frequently that I scarcely had time to catch my breath. A sickly body like mine wasn't up to such frantic activity. My only reason all along for helping the group had been my fascination with its irrationality, and to become so horribly involved was quite unforeseen consequences of my joke. I felt secretly like telling the group, "This isn't my business. Why don't you get a regular party man to do it?" Unable to suppress such reactions of my annoyance, I escaped. I escaped, but it gave me no pleasure. I decided to kill myself. There were at that time 3 women who showed me special affection. One of them was the landlord's daughter at my lodging house. When I would come back to my home room, so exhausted by my errands for the movement that I fell into bed without even bothering to eat. She invariably would visit my room, carrying in her hand a writing pad and a pen. "Excuse me, it's so noisy downstairs with my sister and my little brother that I can't collect my thoughts enough to write a letter." She would seat herself at my desk and write sometimes for over an hour. It would have been so much simpler if I just lay there and pretended not to be aware of her. But the girl's looks betrayed only too plainly that she wanted to talk. And though I had not the least desire to utter a word, I would display my usual spirit of passive service. I would turn over on my belly with a grunt and, puffing on a cigarette, begin, I'm told that some men heat their bath water by burning the love letters they get from women. How horrid! It must be you. As a matter of fact, I have boiled milk that way and drunk it too. What an honor for the girl. Use mine next time. If only she would go quickly. Letter indeed. What a transparent pretext that was. I'm sure she was writing the alphabet, or the days of the week and the months. Show me what you've written, I said, although I wanted desperately to avoid looking at it. No, I won't, she protested. Oh, you're dreadful. Her jaw was indecent enough to chill all feeling for her. I thought up an errand for her to do. Sorry to bother you, but would you mind going down to the drugstore and buying me some sleeping tablets? I'm overexhausted. My face is burning so I can't sleep. I'm sorry, and about the money, that's all right. Don't worry about the money. She got up happily. I was well aware that it never offends a woman to be asked to do an errand. They are delighted if some man designed a task to ask them a favor. The second girl interested in me was a comrade, a student in a teacher's training college. My activities in the movement obliged me, distasteful as it was, to see her every day, even after the arrangement for the day's job had been completely. She doggedly tagged along after me. She bought me presents, seemingly at random, and offered them with the words, I wish you would think of me as your real sister. Wincing at the affection, I would answer, I do, and force a sad little smile. I was afraid of angering her, and my only thought was to temporize somehow and put her off. As a result, I spent more and more time dancing attendance on that ugly, disagreeable girl. I let her buy me presents. They were, without exception, in extraordinarily bad taste, and I usually disposed of them immediately to the postman or the grocery boy. I tried to look happy when I was with her and made her laugh with my jokes. One summer evening, she simply wouldn't leave me. In the hope of persuading her to go, I kissed her when we came to a dark place along the street. She became uncontrollably, shamefully excited. She hailed a taxi and took me to the little room the movement secretly rented in an office building. There we spent the whole night in a wild tumult. What an extraordinary sister I have, I told myself with a wry smile. The circumstances were such that I had no way of avoiding the landlord's daughter or this comrade. Every day we bumped into one another. I could not dodge them, as I had various other women in the past. Before I knew what was happening, my chronic lack of assurance had driven me willy-nilly into desperate attempts to integrate myself with both of them. It was just as if I were bound to them by some ancient debt. It was at this same period that I became the unexpected beneficiary of the kindness of a waitress in one of those big cafes on the Ginza. After just one meeting, I was so tied by gratitude to her that worry and empty fears paralyzed me. I had learned by this time to simulate sufficiently well the audacity required to board a streetcar by myself, or to go to the kabuki theater, or even to the cafe without any guidance from Horiki. Inwardly, I was no less suspicious than before of the same assurance and the violence of human beings, but on the surface, I had learned bit by bit the art of meeting people with a straight face. No, that's not true. I have never been able to meet anyone with an accompaniment of painful smiles, the buffoonery of defeat. What I had acquired was the technique of stammering somehow, almost in a daze, the necessary small talk. Was this a product of my activities on behalf of the movement? Or of women? Or liquor? Perhaps it was chiefly being hard up for cash that perfected the skill. I felt afraid no matter where I was. I wondered if the best way to obtain some surcease from this relentless feeling might not be to lose myself in the world of some big cafe where I would be rubbed against my crowds of drunken guests, waitresses, and porters. With this thought in my mind, I went one day alone to the cafe of the Ginza. I had only 10 yen on me. I said with a smile to the hostess, who sat beside me, "All I've got is 10 yen. Consider yourself warned." "You needn't worry," she spoke with a trace of a Kansai accent. It was strange how she calmed my agitation with those few words. No, it was not simply because I was relieved of the necessity of worrying about money. I felt rather as if being next to her in itself made it unnecessary to worry. I drank the liquor. She did not intimidate me, and I felt no obligation to perform my clownish antics for her. I drank in silence, not bothering to hide the taciturnity and gloominess which were my true nature. She put various appetizers on the table in front of me. "Do you like them?" I shook my head. "Only liquor? I'll have a drink too." It was a cold autumn night. I was waiting at a sushi stall back at the Ginza for Tsuneko. That, as I recall, was her name, but the memory is too blurred for me to be sure. I am the sort of person who can forget even the name of the woman with whom he attempted suicide. To get off from work, the sushi was eating had nothing to recommend it. Why, when I have forgotten her name, should I be able to remember so clearly how bad the sushi tasted? And I can recall with absolute clarity the close cropped head of the old man. His face was like a snake's, wagging from side to side as he made the sushi, trying to create the illusion that he was a real expert. It has happened to me 2 or 3 times since that I have seen on the streetcar what seemed to be a familiar face and wondered who it was, only to realize with a start that the person opposite me looked like the old man from the sushi stall. Now, when her name and even her face are fading from my memory, for me to be able to remember that old man's face so accurately, I could draw it, it's surely a proof of how bad the sushi was, and how it chilled and distressed me. I should add that even when I have been taken to restaurants famous for sushi, I have never enjoyed it much. Tsuneko was living in a room she rented on the second floor of a carpenter's house. I lay on the floor sipping tea, propping my cheek with one hand as if I had a horrible toothache. I took no pains to hide my habitual gloom. Oddly enough, she seemed to like seeing me lie there that way. She gave me the impression of standing completely isolated. An icy storm whipped around her, leaving only dead leaves careening wildly down. As we lay there together, we told me that she was 2 years older than I, and that she came from Hiroshima. "I've got a husband, you know. He used to be a barber in Hiroshima, but we ran away to Tokyo together at the end of last year. My husband couldn't find a decent job in Tokyo. The next thing I knew, he was picked up for swindling someone, and now he's in jail. I've been going to the prison every day, but I'm beginning tomorrow, I'm not going anymore." She rambled on, but I have never been able to get interested when women talk about themselves. It may be because women are so inept in telling a story, that is, because they place the emphasis in the wrong places, or for some other reason. In any case, I have always turned them a deaf ear. "I feel so unhappy." I am sure that this one phrase whispered to me would arouse my sympathy more than the longest, most painstaking account of a woman's life. It amazes and astonishes me that I have never once heard a woman make this simple statement. This woman did not say, "I feel so unhappy," in so many words, but something like a silent current of misery, an inch wide, flowed over the surface of her body. When I lay next to her, my body was enveloped in her current, which mingled with my own harsher current of gloom like a withered leaf settling to rest on the stones of the bottom of a pool. I had freed myself from fear and uneasiness. It was entirely different from the feeling of being able to sleep soundly, which I had experienced in the arms of those idiot prostitutes. For one thing, the prostitutes were cheerful, The night I spent with the criminal's wife was for me a night of liberation and happiness. The use of so bold a word affirmatively, without hesitation, will not, I imagine, recur in these notebooks. But it lasted only one night. In the morning, when I woke and got out of bed, I was again the shallow poseur of a clown, the weak fear happiness itself. They can harm themselves on cotton wool. Sometimes they are wounded even by happiness. I was impatient to leave her while things still stood the same before I got wounded and I spread the usual smokescreen of farce. They say that love flies out the window when poverty comes in the door, but people generally get the sins backwards. It doesn't mean that when a man's money runs out, he's shaken off by a woman. When he runs out of money, he naturally is in the dumps. He's no good for anything. The strength goes out of his laugh, he becomes strangely soured. Finally, in desperation, he shakes off the woman. The proverb means that when a man becomes half mad, he will shake and shake and shake until he's free of a woman. You'll find that explanation gives in the Kanazawa dictionary, more's the pity. It isn't too hard for me to understand that feeling myself. I remember making Tsuneko laugh with just such stupid remarks. I was trying to get away quickly that morning without so much as washing my face, for I was sure that to stay any longer would be useless and dangerous. Then I came out with that crazy pronouncement on love flying out the window, which was later to produce unexpected complications. I didn't meet my benefactor of that night again for a whole month. After leaving her, my happiness grew fainter every day that went by. It frightened me even that I had accepted a moment's kindness. I felt I had imposed horrible bonds on myself. Gradually, even the mundane fact that Tsuneko had paid the bill at the cafe began to weigh on me, and I felt as though she was just another threatening woman, like the girl at my lodging house or the girl with the teaching trainings college. Even at the distance which separated us, intimidated me constantly. Besides, I was intolerably afraid that it met again a woman I had once slept with. I might suddenly burst into flaming rage. It was my nature to be very timid about meeting people anyway, and so I finally chose the expedient of keeping a safe distance from the Ginza. This timidity of nature has no trickery on my part. Women do not bring to bear so much as a particle of connection between what they do after going to bed and what they do on rising in the morning. They go on living with their world successfully divided in two, as if total oblivion had intervened. My trouble was that I could not yet successfully cope with this extraordinary phenomenon. At the end of November, I went drinking with Horiki at a cheap bar in Kanda. We had no sooner staggered out of that bar than my evil companion began to insist that we continue our drinking somewhere else. We had already not run out of money, but he kept badgering me. Finally, and this was because I was drunker and bolder than usual, I said, "All right, I'll take you to the land of dreams. Don't be surprised at what you see. Wine, women, and song." "You mean a cafe?" "I do." "Let's go." It happened just as simply as that. The two of us got on a streetcar. Horiki said in high spirits, "I'm starved for a woman tonight. It is all right to kiss the hostess?" I was not particularly fond of Horiki when he played the drunk that way. Horiki knew it, and he deliberately labored the point. "All right. I'm going to kiss her. I'm going to kiss whichever hostess sits next to me, all right? It won't make any difference, I suppose." Thanks, I'm starved for women." We got off the Ginza and walked into the cafe of wine, women, and song. I was virtually without a penny, and my only hope was Tsuneko. Horiki and I sat down at a vacant booth, facing each other. Tsuneko and another hostess immediately hurried over. The other girl sat next to me, and Tsuneko plopped herself down beside Horiki. I was taken aback. Tsuneko was going to be kissed in another few minutes. It wasn't that I regretted losing her. I have never had the faintest craving for possessions. Once in a while, it is true, I have experienced a vague sense of regret at losing something, but never strongly enough to affirm positively or to contest with others my rights of possession. This was so true of me that some years later I even watched in silence when my own wife was violated. I have tried insofar as possible to avoid getting involved in the sordid complications of human beings. I have been afraid of being sucked down in their bottomless whirlpool. Tsuneko and I were lovers of just one night. She did not belong to me. It was unlikely that I would pretend to so imperious an emotion as regret, and yet I was shocked. It was because I felt sorry for Tsuneko, sorry that she should be obligated to accept Horiki's savage kisses while I watched. Once she had been defiled by Horiki, she would no doubt have to leave me, but my ardor was not positive enough for me to stop Tsuneko. I experienced an instant of shock at her unhappiness. I thought, it's all over now. Then, the next moment, I meekly, helplessly resigned myself. I looked from Horiki to Tsuneko, and I grinned. But the situation took an unexpected turn, one very much for the worse. I've had enough, Horiki said with a scowl. Not even a lecher like myself can kiss a woman who looks so poverty-stricken. He folded his arms and stared, seemingly in utter disgust, at Tsuneko. He forced a smile. Some liquor. I haven't got any money. I spoke under my breath to Tsuneko, and I felt I wanted to drink till I drowned in it. Tsuneko was in the eyes of the world unworthy even for a drunkard's kiss, a wretched woman who smelled of poverty. Astonishingly, incredibly enough, this realization struck me with the force of a thunderbolt. I drank more that night than ever before in my life. More and more. My eyes swam with drink, and every time Tsuneko and I looked in each other's face, we gave a pathetic little smile. Yes, just as Horiki had said, she really was a tired, poverty-stricken woman and nothing more. But this thought itself was accompanied by a welling up of a feeling of comradeship for this fellow sufferer from poverty. The clash between rich and poor is a hackneyed enough subject, but I am now convinced that it really is one of the eternal themes of drama. I felt pity for Tsuneko. For the first time in my life, I was conscious of a positive, if feeble, movement of love in my heart. I vomited. I passed out. This was also the first time I had ever drunk so much as to lose consciousness. When I woke, Tsuneko was sitting by my pillow. I had been sleeping in the room on the second floor of the carpenter's house. I thought you were joking when you told me that your love flew out the window when poverty came in the door. Were you serious? You didn't come any more. What a complicated business it is, love and poverty. Suppose I worked for you? Wouldn't that be all right? No, it wouldn't. She lay down beside me. Towards dawn, she pronounced for the first time the word death. She, too, seemed to be weary, beyond endurance to the task of being a human being. And when I reflected on my dread of the world and its bothersomeness on money, the movement, women, my studies, it seemed impossible that I could go on living. I consented easily to her proposal. Nevertheless, I was still unable to persuade myself fully of the reality of this resolution to die. Somehow there lurked an element of make believe. The two of us spent that morning wandering around Asakusa. We went into a lunch stand and drank a glass of milk. She said, "You pay this time." I stood up, took out my wallet, and opened it. 3 copper coins. It was less shame than horror that assaulted me at the same moment. I suddenly saw before my eyes my room in the lodging house, absolutely empty save for my school uniform and the bedding. A bleak cell devoid of any object which might be pawned. My only other possessions were the kimono and coat I was wearing. These were the hard facts. I perceived with clarity that I could not go on living. And as I stood there, hesitating, she got up and looked inside my wallet. "Is that all you have?" Her voice was innocent, but it cut me to the quick. It was painful, as only the voice of the first woman I had ever loved could be painful. "Is that all?" No, even that suggested more money than I had. 3 copper coins don't count as money at all. This was a humiliation more strange than any I had tasted before, a humiliation I could not live with. I suppose I had still not managed to extricate myself from the part of the rich man's son. It was then I myself determined, this time as a reality, to kill myself. We threw ourselves into the sea at Kamakura that night. She untied her sash, saying she had borrowed it from a friend at the cafe and left it folded neatly on the rock. I removed my coat and put it in the same spot. We entered the water together. She died. I was saved. The incident was treated rather prominently in the press, no doubt because I was a college student. My father's name also had some news value, and I was confined in a hospital on the coast. A relative came from home to see me and take care of the necessary arrangements. Before he left, he informed me that my father and all the rest of my family were so enraged that I might easily be disowned once and for all. Such matters did not concern me. I thought instead of the dead Tsuneko, and longing for her, I wept. Of all the people I had ever known, that miserable Tsuneko really was the only one I loved. A long letter, which consisted of a string of 50 stanzas, came from the girl at my lodging house. 50 stanzas, each one beginning with the incredible words, "Please live on for me." The nurses used to visit my sick room, laughing gaily at the same time, and some would squeeze my hand when they left. They discovered at the hospital that my left lung was affected. This was most fortunate for me, when, not long afterwards, I was taken from the hospital to a police station, charged with having been the accomplice to a suicide. I was treated as a sick man by the police and quartered, not with the criminals, but in a special custody room. Late at night, the old policeman, standing night duty in the room next to mine, softly opened the door. "Hey!" he called to me. "You must be cold. Come here, next to the fire." I walked into his room, sat on a chair, and warmed myself by the fire. I feigned an air of utter dejection. "You miss her, don't you?" "Yes," I answered in a particularly faint and faraway voice. "That's human nature, I guess." His manners had become increasingly self-important. "Where was it you first took up with this woman?" The question was weighted with an authority almost indistinguishable from that of a judge. My jailer, despising me as a mere child who wouldn't know the difference, acted exactly as if he were charged with the investigation. No doubt he was secretly hoping to while away the long autumn evening by extracting from me a confession in the nature of a pornographic story. I guessed his intent at once, and it was all I could do to restrain the impulse to burst out laughing in his face. I knew that I had the right to refuse to answer any inquiries put me by the policeman in an informal interrogation of this sort, but in order to lend some interest to the long night ahead, I cloaked myself in a kind of simple sincerity, as if I firmly, unquestioningly believed that this policeman was responsible for investigating me, and that the degree of severity of my punishment depended solely on his decision. I made up a confession absurd enough to satisfy more or less his prurient curiosity. Hmm, I've got a pretty good idea now. We always take it into consideration when a prisoner answers everything honestly. Thank you very much. I hope you'll do what you can to help me. My performance was all but inspired, a great performance which brought me to benefit whatsoever. In the morning I was called before the police chief. This time it was a real examination. As soon as I opened the door and entered his office, the police chief said, "There's the handsome lad for you. It wasn't your fault, I can see. Your mother's to blame for having brought such a handsome boy into the world." He was still young, a dark complexioned man with something about him which suggested a university education. His words caught me off guard, and made me as wretched as if I had been born deformed with a red macula covering half my face. The examination conducted by this athletic looking police chief was simple and to the point. A world removed from the furtive tenaciously obscene examination the old policeman had given me the night before. After he finished his questioning, he filled out a form to send to the district attorney's office. He commented as he wrote, "You mustn't neglect your health that way. You've been coughing blood, haven't you?" That morning I had an odd, hawking cough, and every time I coughed I covered my mouth with my handkerchief. The handkerchief was spattered with blood, but it was not blood from my throat. The night before I had been picking at a pimple under my ear, and the blood was from that pimple. Realizing at once that it would be to my advantage not to reveal the truth, I lowered my eyes and sanctimoniously murmured, "Yes." The police chief finished writing the paper. "It's up to the district attorneys whether or not they bring action against you, but it would be a good idea to telephone or telegraph a guarantor to come to the district attorney's office in Yokohama. There must be someone, isn't there, who will guarantee you or offer bail?" I remembered the man from my hometown, an antique dealer who was a frequent visitor of my father's house in Tokyo, had served as my guarantor at school. He was a short-set man of 40, a bachelor and a henchman of my father's. His face, particularly around the eyes, looked so much like a flatfish that my father always called him by that name. I had also always thought of him as Flatfish. I borrowed the telephone directory at the police station to look up Flatfish's number. I found it and called him. I asked if he would mind coming to Yokohama. Flatfish's tone, when he answered, was unrecognizably officious, but he agreed in the end to be my guarantor. I went back to the custody room. The police chief's loud voice reached me as he barked out to the policeman, "Hey, somebody disinfected the telephone receiver. He's been coughing blood, you know." In the afternoon, they tied me up with a thin hemp rope. I was allowed to hide the rope under my coat when we went outside, but the young policeman gripped the end of the rope firmly. He went to Yokohama on the streetcar. The experience hadn't upset me in the least. I missed the custody room in the police station and even the old policeman. What, I wonder, makes me that way? When they tied me up as a criminal, I actually felt relieved, a calm, relaxed feeling. Even now, as I write down my recollections of those days, I feel a really expansive, agreeable sensation. But among my otherwise nostalgic memories, there is one harrowing disaster which I shall never be able to forget, and which even now causes me to break out into a cold sweat. I was given a brief examination by the district attorney in his dimly lit office. He was a man of about 40, with an intelligent calm about him which I am tempted to call honest good looks, in contrast to my own alleged good looks, which, even if true, certainly are tainted with lewdness. He seemed so simple and straightforward that I had let down my guard completely. I was listlessly recounting my story when suddenly I was seized with another fit of coughing. I took out my handkerchief, the blood stains caught my eye, and with ignoble opportunism I thought that this cough might also prove useful. I added a couple of extra exaggerated coughs for good measure, and, my mouth still covered by the handkerchief, I glanced at the district attorney's face. The next instant he asked with his quiet smile, "Was that real?" Even now the recollection makes me feel so embarrassed I can't sit still. It was worse, I am sure, even than when in high school I was plummeted into hell by that stupid Takeichi tapping me on the back and saying you did it on purpose. Those were the two great disasters in a lifetime of acting. Sometimes I had even thought that I should have preferred to be sentenced to 10 years imprisonment rather than meet with such a gentle contempt from the district attorney. The charge against me was suspended, but this brought no joy. I felt utterly wretched as I sat on a bench in the corridor outside the district attorney's office, waiting for the arrival of my guarantor, Flatfish. I could see, though, the tall windows behind my bench, the evening sky glowing in the sunset. Seagulls were flying by in a line which somehow suggested the curve of a woman's body.